Let's take a moment and remember that our cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, is incredibly important to the functioning of the central nervous system for several reasons. It acts as a shock absorber, right? It's a fluid that surrounds the organs of especially the brain, and adds kind of a shock absorber, a bumper kind of a thing to keep the brain suspended so it's not banging against the bones of the skull. And it acts as a supply chain. It's bringing in virtually everything that the neuron is going to need to survive: oxygen, glucose, ions, other nutrients, and it's removing waste, carbon dioxide, and any other waste product. So without the cerebrospinal fluid moving, your central nervous system, specifically your brain, would be very, very compromised. Now, it makes sense that the cerebrospinal fluid has to be getting those supplies from someplace, and that someplace is going to be the blood. The blood is going to be the supplier for the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, if you think about the diagrams and the things that you've been working on in lab, you'll notice that there is a great arterial supply, a huge amount of blood vessels coming into the brain. That's to bring all of these nutrients and oxygen and such into the central nervous system. Right? So it's very richly vascularized for that reason. Now, we remember that our cerebrospinal fluid is formed by the choroid plexus. This sentence, however, isn't talking about how the cerebrospinal fluid is being formed. It's talking about the blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier. That's formed by the choroid plexus. It's really a very, very effective filter. Filter would be a good word, thinking about our types of diffusion. Right? It's a very, very good filter that selectively allows substances to pass into the cerebrospinal fluid. Well, what would we want to pass into the cerebrospinal fluid? Well, obviously, we would want the glucose, we would want the ions, we would want the oxygen, right? What wouldn't we want to pass into the cerebrospinal fluid, thinking about how delicate and fragile those darn neurons are? Because remember, we got to keep in mind that the neurons are virtually helpless. That's why they have all of those glial cells to help them. Add to that the fact that they cannot reproduce. We really, really do have to keep them protected. And that's where this blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier comes into place. So, back to the original question, what would we not want to pass into this cerebrospinal fluid? Well, obviously, we wouldn't want any microorganisms. We wouldn't want bacteria or viruses to pass across. And really, it's very, very effective at that. There are exceptions to the rules. You hear people getting meningitis, okay, which is an inflammation of an infection of those meninges that we talked about, those coverings, bacterial and viral. It's rare, thank goodness, but it's rare. So, but again, bottom line is we want to prevent those microorganisms from getting access. Like we want to protect the president. It doesn't matter who the president is, but we want to protect the president because there's only one of him or her, and we want to make sure that they are insulated and protected from harm. And that's what we're doing here with our neurons. We would want to protect the neurons from toxic substances, poisons, certain drugs. Now, again, certain drugs do pass across the cerebrospinal fluid barrier, pass across this barrier. We need them to. Okay, psychiatric meds we need to get across. However, we want to be very, very specific and very particular about what's being able to pass across to get access to the control center, and that's where this blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier comes into play. Now, let's talk about some of the structures of the brain. We talked about 4 regions, and the brainstem was one, right? We had the brainstem, diencephalon, cerebellum, and cerebrum. We're going to start in the brainstem. And it's just that. It's the stem part of the brain. It's made up of several different structures, right? First, we have the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata is structurally and functionally a continuation of the spinal cord. A common question in lab at this point is, okay, how do I know I've gone from the spinal cord to the medulla oblongata? If it's one piece, how do I know I've crossed over? Typically, the marker for going from the spinal cord to the medulla oblongata is the occipital bone. Okay, the foramen magnum is the border, if you will. So if I'm superior to the foramen magnum, if I'm superior to that, I'm the spinal cord. If I'm inferior to that, I am the spinal cord. In the medulla oblongata, we're going to find all of our ascending and descending tracts. Okay, so this is going to be our passageway for information, or conduit for information to go from the spinal cord up into the brain. Here we're going to find pyramids. A pyramid is a descending nerve tract that deals with the conscious control of skeletal muscle. There's a lot there. Okay, so conscious control is I'm going to walk down the street. I'm taking steps, I'm deciding, I'm making a conscious decision to make those steps. That's conscious control of skeletal muscle. Okay, not those twitchy kind of things, those body corrections that we've talked about. I'm making a decision, a choice to move that muscle. These are descending nerve tracts. This is motor information coming from the central nervous system down to the skeletal muscles to cause that movement to happen, right? But it's only descending, and it's only conscious control of skeletal muscle. So it's very, very painfully specific. Near the inferior end of these pyramids that we talk about, the tracts, the descending tracts, do something called they decussate. Okay, really fancy word that simply means they cross over. Well, that really makes a lot of sense, because if you've had a grandparent, a great-grandparent who's had a stroke, and you say, yeah, the left side of the brain has been involved in this stroke. Well, how do the doctors know that? Well, because she can't move the right side of her body. Well, wait a minute. You said that it was the left side of the brain. That's because we have, as humans, as most mammals, we have something called contralateral control. Contra is opposite, lateral is side. So our brain controls the opposite side of our body. So if our right side is compromised, that means that the damage was on the left side of our brain. And this crisscrossing of the wires, quote unquote wires if you will, is called decussation. They decussate. We're also going to find nuclei that are going to act as centers that control heart rate, breathing, swallowing, and vomiting. If you're not sure what a nucleus is with reference to your central nervous system, you want to go back to those slides that talk about that, okay? And again, when we talked about this originally, this is where the nervous system is tough, because there are so many words and they mean very, very specific things. So you have to be aware of that. Okay, so we have these nuclei that are control centers, literally control centers. We call them centers, a heart rate center, breathing, a respiratory center, those sorts of things. But they are control centers for heart rate, breathing, swallowing, vomiting. You'll remember, hopefully, when we started talking about the brain, and I listed all of our 4 regions of the brain, that we as humans get really kind of snobbish and we only care about the cerebrum, that the other parts of the brain don't matter. Well, here you have it. We have in the medulla oblongata, one of the more inferior, lower portions of the brain, centers that are controlling your heart beating, your breathing, your ability to swallow. Those are kind of things that keep you alive. So, although they may not play a role in great thought, they certainly are very, very important when it comes to keeping you alive. Next, we have the pons. The pons lies directly above the medulla oblongata, or superior to the medulla oblongata, and in front of the cerebellum. Again, we're going to have nuclei and white fibers. Again, white fibers are those that are myelinated. We're going to find ascending and descending tracts, and this makes perfect sense if we think about the position, the anatomical position. It's in the pathway from the spinal cord up into the other sections of the brain, so of course these ascending and descending tracts are going to pass through the pons. We also find, they act as a relay station between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And again, I think my next slide has a diagram, or in a slide or two has a diagram, and you'll be able to see the positioning that the pons is kind of right in the middle of the intersection of all of these very important structures. We also find a respiratory center contained within the pons. So it's going to be a nucleus that's in charge of respiration or assisting respiration in some component. Okay, here's our diagram. So we have our spinal cord in yellow, we have our medulla oblongata, and superior to that we have our pons. Right? Looking at this diagram, and again, we're not going to use our anatomical directional terms at this moment, but if we look to the left of the pons, there's our cerebellum. If we look above our pons, there's the cerebrum. So it makes perfect sense that this is going to work as some kind of a connection, a relay station for information passing from the spinal cord up to the other parts of the brain. Next, we have the midbrain. It extends from the pons to the lower portion of the diencephalon. The diencephalon is another section, another region of the brain. It consists of descending tracts from the cerebrum to the spinal cord. So this is going to be motor information, efferent information coming down from the cerebrum to the spinal cord to send information to the effector organs. Here we will have the visual reflex center. The visual reflex center doesn't process visual information. This isn't what allows you to quote unquote see. The visual reflex center is when you're seeing something and there's a reflex to it. If I'm going to throw a rock at your head, you're not going to sit there and go, look at that. There's a rock coming at my head. I wonder what that's about. You're going to have a reflexive action where you're going to duck, where you're going to kind of protect yourself. And that's where this response would come from.